In this video, we're going to revise the Cratchit family. The Cratchit family linking with two massive themes in this text. One is the suffering of the poor, and one's obviously family and community. In my direct knowledge, I've said this key thesis point that we all need to know. Dickens says the poor aren't monsters, they're good people. And that's the message he's trying to give with the Cratchits. Key context about the Poor Law Amendment Act. It meant that the workhouse was the ultimate deterrent for the poor. Dickens thought that the workhouse treated the poor as criminal rather than humane. Remember, there was no welfare state, there were no benefits. If you couldn't afford to look after yourself, you go to the workhouse. The idea was that you worked for your food and for your shelter. Meant you never earn money, you never get out. There was a lack of trade union representation at those times, okay? That meant that workers were at the mercy of the bosses. And we see this as Cratchit. Cratchit's treated dreadfully by Scrooge, but he's got no say. Nobody kind of will go into battle for him in terms of that. He has to put up with being treated dreadfully in order to survive. Cratchit's at work, and we're told that Bob Cratchit works in a dismal little cell. And that can be seen as a metaphor for the life of Bob Cratchit. You know, he's trapped in monotony and the dismal. He's trapped in darkness at work. When this is mentioned, Scrooge in the same room as him. And it makes Scrooge almost like the jailer. You know, he keeps a close eye on Cratchit. He locks him up. And that's symbolic of his lack of charity and a lack of hope. Cratchit works in the cell, so he's trapped by the greed of Scrooge at the beginning of the text. Okay, he's a victim of the selfish rich. This bottom one's really important that I want you to remember. Bob Cratchit and all the Cratchit family symbolise what Dickens saw as the honourable poor. Poor people who have honour and dignity. The humane, the hard-working, the good people. Scrooge represents the opposite. He's the worst of the 9th century privileged. He's selfish. He's blind to what's important. He only cares about himself. So Cratchit and Scrooge symbolise something bigger in Dickens' society, and we know that's vitally important. Cratchit repeats to describe when he talks to Scrooge. He's forced to be subservient to Scrooge. Again, we see that he's honourable. You know, he isn't some savage beast. He's a good person who speaks to Scrooge with respect, even when Scrooge doesn't deserve it. But we see Scrooge, who's described as growling and is described as having red eyes, thin lips, blue, is some kind of beast, and he doesn't deserve how good Cratchit is to him. When we think of the Cratchits, clearly we're thinking about Stave 3, Ghost Christmas Present, that takes them to the Cratchit Christmas. I want you to note importantly here, okay, and you'll make notes on this. In the 19th century stereotype of the poor was people who were idle, immoral, lazy, drunk, or lascivious or full of lust. Dickens uses the Cratchit family to show that these stereotypes were not the case. The Cratchit family is seen to be Christian, hard-working, loving, stoical, so they put a brave face on. The Cratchit parents know that they struggle, but they put a brave face on for the kids. And Dickens asks us to celebrate that. I'm going to look through a few quotations now from the Cratchit Christmas. "Whatever has got your precious father then," said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother Tiny Tim, and Martha." Mrs. Cratchit used that word precious to describe her husband and the children's father, and we know that precious has connotations of being a jewel. The jewel in this family crown is the father who works hard for them, and she knows that. Within this quotation, she lists 3 people in the family, Mrs. Cratchit does. Bob, Tiny Tim, and Martha, a daughter. We see that within that list, nobody's left out or missing. And, you know, that quotation symbolises unity. These children are valued. Dickens wants to see these parents as good parents. They are idols to us. "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times. This describes how she treats Martha Cratchit when she comes into the Cratchit house. We see religious lexical language here, bless, okay, and dear, godly and Christian. Dickens tells us that this woman, despite being poor, is ultimately good. She isn't a monster. She's a good Christian woman. Kissing a dozen times. Exaggeration, hyperbole, numerical language. It just shows that there's an outpouring of love. This Cratchit family, it is sentimental, but we get the sense that they love each other. The Cratchit children, running, tearing, screaming, rejoicing. All of these are verbs that describe the Cratchit children just before the Christmas lunch. The verbs are rapid, frantic, energetic, physical. When we think of that word rejoicing, there's also godly connotations with that. Again, Dickens telling us that these children are good, honest, Christian people. The poor weren't monsters, the good people. Dickens humanises the poor here. He presents them as normal children. They are normal. Those of you who have studied Inspector Calls, you'll see that Priestley does the same thing with Eva Smith. He presents her as being pretty in the same way. Okay? Both of these writers humanise the poor. They aren't monsters, they're good people. Perhaps there's a key message here. We should see these children as any other children. We shouldn't be like the 19th century privileged who see them as a surplus population. These are good people. They have the Christmas lunch, and in this quotation it says, Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of bone upon the dish. They hadn't ate it all at last. I think this is one of the big examples of where we see this family is just putting a brave face on what they're doing. They've got this Christmas goose in the middle of the table, and the whole family, well, Cratchit particularly, are surveying an atom of bone. Basically, they've eaten the whole carcass of this animal. You know, there's nothing left of it. There's an atom of bone left. We see really in this quotation that this family are in desperate hunger. Okay, they eat like an animal would eat. They're like scavengers. We pity that they're in this situation, but Dickens shows that they aren't self-pitying. They put on a brave face for the children. The children think that this is a great day. And Dickens tells us to respect these parents as just being great people. Again, the poor are monsters, the good people. That's what Dickens is telling us. After the Christmas lunch, they all get together. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. They sit around the fire, and there's the idea that they get all the best stuff out, you know. But this custard cup that they've got, like a jug, is a metaphor for Tiny Tim. It's broken, it's pretty much unusable, but the family place it on display. They're proud of it. Tumblers, they represent the parents. Tumblers are solid, dependable, they're always there. There's nothing kind of glamorous about them, but they're solid, and we have that. Ultimately, in this, we see the idea that the Cratchit family make do and do their best. They're grateful. And look how they draw round in a circle or half a one. There isn't a full circle there, but they're unified. God bless us, everyone, said Tiny Tim last of all. Nothing's done as coincidence. Dickens uses religious lexis or language for the most vulnerable character. He could have presented Tiny Tim as angry, sullen, forlorn, sulky, but he doesn't. He gives him these lines like bless us all, ideas of forgiveness, okay? Poverty doesn't trouble him. He's sheltered by his parents, and ultimately, he promotes peace, if you want to use Catholic social teaching. I just want you to think that Tiny Tim, in the name, was supposed to feel sorrow for him. Dickens gives him that name to tell us that this boy is vulnerable and he suffers, and he wants us to feel sorry for him. Bob Cratchit says that Tiny Tim was as good as gold. Now, we know that's a simile, and a lot of you will have heard me say this a lot, but gold is something that a family like the Cratchits would never possess. It wasn't something you could save up for. To them, gold is magic. And there's a key message there. This is a family who live in abject poverty, but this boy is as good as having riches. And that shows how powerful their love is for him. They love him as much as something that would take away all their worries. And Dickens gives us his absolute key message here about family. If you have family and unity and community, you have everything that you need. That's what he's suggesting. We know in stage 4 we see the doomed future. If things don't change, this is what it'll become. And in stage 4 we see a future where Tiny Tim has died. And Bob Cratchit comes in and he says, "My little child," cried Bob, "my little child." The idea of grief. We see the idea that the family are broken by the death of Tiny Tim. And we see repetition. Now, we've talked about repetition before in a few texts. For example, Macduff, "Oh, horror, horror, horror." When we see repetition, it is Cratchit losing the capacity to speak clearly. He's ruined and he can only think of using simple words. Grief and sadness take over Bob Cratchit. And again, we think, Dickens wants us to think, this man, who's a good man, doesn't deserve this. We're also told about how the other Cratchit children react to Tiny Tim's death in the future. Quiet, very quiet. They're always little Cratchits, but still statues in one corner. So still statues is a simile. Now we know that a statue is grey, and these children are now lifeless, and they're just bodies. And this description is the total opposite or antithesis to the Cratchit children who are running, tearing, screaming, rejoicing in stage 3. Dickens gives us this message: when one person is taken out of this family unit, in this case Tiny Tim, and unity's broken, nothing remains. They're all pretty much dead from it. This is Dickens' message about the power of poverty and the power of family. Poverty can destroy the vulnerable in society, and when we break the chain of a family, he says that kind of destruction happens. Okay? The change in the Cratchits here represents the idea of a Christmas miracle. When in stage 5 they're saved, that's the Christmas miracle. So key things that we're thinking about the Cratchits is they represent the honourable poor. They represent Dickens' view that if you've got family, you've got everything. And ultimately, he wants us to idolise those parents because they put a brave face on the absolute devastating poverty in which they live. Remember that Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol to make a point. Society. They are man's. Mankind was my business. If we don't look after people like Cratchits, then we're doomed to failure. That's the Cratchits.